My name is Billy Dowling. I'm an application consultant with EpiCenter. Today we are going to be going over AR electronic invoicing, or as Epicor refers to it as e-invoicing. This is a functionality that was released in 10.2.500. So if you're not on 10.2.500, this will not be a part of your Epicor environment. However, if you like what you see and you want to upgrade to the latest release of 10.2.600, feel free to, get in contact with Kevin and see what we can do about helping you out with an upgrade. So to start, the target audience for electronic invoicing typically is going to be your accounts receivable department. It could be a cost accountant, your ERP manager and administrator, and that's, strictly to get things set up and configured. Inside sales, customer service, and your CFO and controller. Basically, with this, what e-invoicing is going to allow you to do is basically process most of your accounts receivable invoices using a function that will generate invoices, attach them to your invoice record in the system, and allow you to mass generate emails to send out to your customers. So what we're going to talk about today is basically why a customer would want to use an e-invoicing, which is pretty obvious. And then we're going to just go into basically the configuration, what modules you need to be aware of and set up and configure prior to actually using this functionality. It starts with the report styles. There's actually a separate report style for AR invoices, electronic invoices. There's an email template set up. So basically that's the email that's going to accompany the invoice attachment to your customer. We have to do some things in company configuration, and that's basically just to activate e-invoicing in your environment. Attachments. So the system actually will need to attach the record, the invoice, your PDF or XML file to your invoice table. And that's actually what will allow the system to send the email from the application. And that will be done using the attachments modules. And there's two different attachments. It's different for 10.2.500 and 600, and I'll show you each as we go through this presentation. Transaction document types, you may be already aware of these, but this is actually tied to, it's linking attachments or transactions basically to legal numbers. We'll go through that as well. And then also this can be customer specific. So you can have one customer be an e-invoice customer and you can have another customer not. So it's setting it up inside of customer maintenance and allowing customers to have either, their own e-invoice report style and their own email template that accompanies their emails, and so on. And then we'll just talk about the tools that are available for you using e-invoicing. And then we'll wrap up with some questions and answers. All right, so to start, why electronic invoicing? As I said, it's pretty obvious. A lot of, we're technology is, going into the future, and we're getting to become less reliant on paper and hard copies. There are still some customers, I understand that, print invoices and file them and mail them. And that's just not the way that we should operate as we go into the future. One thing, in particular is saving the planet, reducing paper, also increasing productivity. Of course, whenever you have electronic invoicing inside of Epicor, you're able to actually process all of these emails without ever leaving the Epicor client. So you're not having to open up Outlook and type in your email address to each of your customers and attach the document. Those can be some monotonous steps that, that can get quite time consuming. The immediate send and receipt is definitely a benefit. Expense savings, accessibility and convenience. We had, I don't know about you, but we had the Bob Marley printers at our, my old company that I used to work at. And, those, of course, are the ones that be jamming, but that's my only joke of today. So hopefully you enjoyed that. All right, next we're going to get into the report styles. So as I mentioned, if you're aware of anything to do with report styles, there is a report style for all of your reports inside of Epicor. Inside 10.2, 500, and 600, there's actually an AR form e-invoice. So from my experience of actually, deploying this, what I recommend for customers to do is actually, if they have an AR form that they're using that's already been modified with their logos, and then added fields customized to their liking, I recommend using, downloading that AR form and then uploading it as the AR e-invoice form as a separate report style. Now, whenever you set these up, they can be either XML or PDF. So you would just make sure that you select the correct one on how you would like these to be sent to your customer. And then, as I mentioned, they can be specific for customers. So if you can add multiple report styles for AR e-invoices, and then inside customer maintenance, tie them to whatever customer has their own report style. As I mentioned earlier, there's an email template that you can design and that will accompany the attached invoice. This can be found under financial management, accounts receivable setup, and email template. And that's where you're going to find most of the modules we're working in today. The benefit of using the email template is you can actually add placeholders that will pull the fields. So for example, if you set up an email that you see in the picture here, the email will actually, generate the invoice number, invoice date, whatever placeholder text you put in there, which is pretty a nice feature. One of the things too that I recommend is a little note at the bottom of not replying to the emails, because some customers may think that they're actually communicating with someone, but it's just a system email that you cannot respond to. 10.2.600 actually allows HTML formatting. So this screenshot you see here is actually from the 10.2.600 environment. You can see that this one's particularly formatted to plain text. You can change it in HTML and .600. Unfortunately, that's not available in .500. But what that allows you to do is you can open up like a free HTML editor and modify the email to have, certain tables or logos, or you just have a little bit more customization that you can do inside of this email template instead of the out-of-the-box placeholders that Epicor offers. And again, you can set up multiple email templates. Inside of customer maintenance, you can have each customer with their own email template if you prefer. Next, I'm just going to briefly touch on the company configuration. This is more or less just so you have this, if you plan on deploying this in your environment. You actually have to go into company configuration to unlock e-invoicing.
Hey,
I have this. Yes, ma'am.
Your screen's not displaying.
Yeah.
Has it not been displaying for the whole presentation?
No,
well, it stopped a couple slides back.
Yeah.
I apologize. I'm not sure what happened there. What slide were we on? The report styles. Did everyone see the report styles?
Yeah.
Thank you. So here's I'll go back to the email template. I apologize there. Thank you, Deb. So here is the slide on the email template. And as I mentioned, here are your placeholders that I've included here that Epicor offers. And as I mentioned, you can use an HTML editor and .600 to pull other customizations inside the email. All right, and then we get into company configuration. As I mentioned, this is just accessing e-invoicing in your system, in your company. So you have to actually go into company configuration. There's actually a tab in the accounts receivable section of company configuration where you actually unlock e-invoicing. So you need to check that box there. You can have a default report style, but again, this can be specific for customers. And then the default from email address, the default to and default CC, we can kind of ignore because again, that's going to be set up on the customer level. And then also your default email templates, invoice path, transaction documents, and so on. Next, we have to actually define the attachments inside of the system. Now I have two different screenshots here. One is from .500 and one is from .600. So in .500, you actually have to go into company maintenance and enable a file system transfer type that basically allows the system to attach your invoice to the invoice record, your PDF or XML. So the little arrows you see over here on the .500 are some of the things that you actually need to make sure are selected prior to setting this up and using this. Now in .600, they've released attachment type maintenance, and that's actually a separate module. You do not set that up in company maintenance. Attachments are no longer in company maintenance in .600. It's on modules, so you need to go in and make sure that you have set up a file system storage type in .600 with a base URL, and the base URL can actually be found inside of your system task agent. And then one thing to note here is you have to enable it and actually have a company default. Now I don't have that selected here, but you need a company default prior to actually utilizing e-invoicing. And also with the inside of attachment maintenance, they offer other features with the way you handle attachments. If you want to, link them to a Google Drive, if you want to link them to a Dropbox, that's some of the new features that .600 allows you to do with attachments. Transaction document type. So this is actually where you go in and say that you're going to create a transaction document type. So any of our accounting folks here know that there's usually a document type when you're entering invoices. You actually have to set one up for the e-invoice, and there's a tab actually inside of the transaction document type for you to activate that document type as your e-invoice. Now again, this will have to be selected on your customer side when we get into inside of customer maintenance. And lastly, it's customer maintenance. So it's basically opening up a customer inside of customer maintenance. If anyone's in .500, .600, they maybe noticed this tab already, but there's an e-invoice tab where you activate the e-invoice for the customer. And then also there is a button for send email. So I don't see why you wouldn't want to use a send email function, because this is the benefit of e-invoicing. But if it's a case where you just wanted to generate the e-invoice to attach to the invoice record, you can uncheck send email. But in order for you to actually process and send the emails, make sure you click that send email button. A couple other things to note here is that you need a default to email address. And then also you have to make sure that there is an email address on your customer detail tab. If you activate e-invoicing for a customer and they don't have an email address on the customer detail tab, you'll get an error message from Epicor. But again, you can see here that we can have our own email template for each customer, as well as our own default report style for each customer. All right, and then we get into the e-invoicing tools that Epicor provides. So as I mentioned a couple of times, a mass generate e-invoice is a process that you run. So basically, if you have several e-invoices that you've created, you can run the mass generate e-invoice process. I'm sorry, if you've had some that you've posted, you run mass generate e-invoice that actually generates the e-invoice and actually sends the electronic invoices as attachments to the customers that are set up. There's also a dashboard that Epicor releases with this functionality. Inside the dashboard, it'll show you all of the e-invoices. You can filter it however you like, by date, by customer, and it shows you the status, if they're still open, if they were sent, if they're generated, if there was an error message. There's also a report that accompanies this, and there's also the ability to manually send and generate single e-invoices, and that's using AR Invoice Tracker. So I'm going to jump in the system here and just show you a couple of the things that we've set up. So currently I am in Epicor 10.2.600, and I'm going to start with the the email template. So you can see here is my template that we created for this particular scenario. I've went in and used the placeholders that you see here. Here's where you can actually change your format if you would like to do HTML instead. And then you can also format your dates and your amounts as well. But notice I just did the basic placeholders here, and we'll see once we actually generate an e-invoice the way this holds. Also for e-invoicing, as I mentioned, you need to set up the attachment type. For e-invoicing, you need to make sure the attachment type is file system and that you have a base URL behind this. And again, this base URL is going to be found inside of your system agent. And you can copy that and place that in there. And then also verify that it's enabled and you have a company default as well. Next, I am actually going to go into enter an e-invoice, and we're going to do a miscellaneous invoice for a customer to go through the process of the way the e-invoice works using the manual process. And then we will look inside of our dashboard and go from there. But you can also see here is your report style. Notice it's its own report ID. If you're not familiar with report styles, you can actually go in and download and upload SSRS reports. So that's one of the things that I would recommend if you're setting up e-invoicing. Just use the AR form report style that you have, and if you've had customized it, load it up into your ARE form as well. All right, so I'm going to go into invoice entry and enter a miscellaneous invoice for a customer that we have set up as an e-invoice customer. That customer today is going to be Cat. You can see that I have them set up as an e-invoice customer with the standard report style. Also noted as send email, and we've noted the email template that we had set up as well. So I'm going to do a new group here real quickly. And we're going to do a new miscellaneous invoice. And a couple things here to consider. Notice when I entered this customer in, the document type defaulted to ARE invoice. And that is because the e-invoice for CAT or for every customer is set up into that transaction document type. So inside of that transaction document type, I created an ARE invoice, and I made sure that it was selected as the e-invoice document type. Now, if we get into credits and certain things like that, if say I did a credit here, it's going to have a different transaction document type. Even though that CAT is linked as an e-invoice customer, we have a different document type because we actually have this set up as another transaction document type. So you have to be aware of these transaction document types that already exist in your system. So if there was a credit memo that you wanted to consider as an e-invoice, you need to go in and make sure that's activated as well as an e-invoice. But for our case here, we're just going to do a miscellaneous invoice for CAT. We have the document type as ARE invoice, and then you also in 10.2600, you have this field down here that's actually showing you that this will be an e-invoice. In .500, it's a separate tab. I'm going to do a new miscellaneous line and post an invoice. Save, and we are going to just post this. All right, as I mentioned, there is an e-invoice status dashboard that is available for you. This is where you'll actually go and review all of the e-invoices that were processed in your system. This is what the screen looks like. I'm going to hit a refresh here. So you notice I've already had a few e-invoices that were already done in our system. Some of them have status as sent. Some of them have them open, generated, so on. So for the one that I just did was this 10282 here. If I wanted to manually process this as an e-invoice, I can open up Invoice Tracker from here. And there's 2 steps that are required to actually email the invoice. So first, you actually have to go into Actions, e-invoice, and Generate. Now, again, this is the manual way of doing this. There's a lot simpler solution to do a mass generate an e-invoice for several e-invoices that you've generated. So here I have e-invoice generation open, and it's filtered by the invoice that I'm in. I'm going to click Process, and I'm going to close. Inside of your Invoice Tracker header, we have an e-invoice tab. It will let you know the status of the e-invoice. Notice it still says open here. I'm going to do a refresh, and we see generated. Now notice the attachment came over, attached to the invoice. If I go through my tree here, I can double click that and view the e-invoice that was created. Now this was based off the report style that is done for AR form e-invoice. Typically, before e-invoicing, customers would use a BPM, or maybe they would actually process an email directly from the print preview screen. We're not going to be too concerned about that here, because once you start running the mass generate, it's going to save a lot of time and issues there. The next step for the manual transmission of the e-invoice is to hit Actions, e-invoice, Send by email. Now notice it brings up our email template that we created. We have Dear Caterpillar because we had customer name there. And then it brought over your invoice number, your date, and your invoice amount based on how we set up our email template. So if I were to hit OK here, it would process and send the email to the customer. In this particular case, I'm not going to do that because this is not a good email address, so I'm going to hit cancel. But after you do that, you would get a message here that says sent. Now I'm going to manually mark this one as sent, but in theory, that's the way it would work. So your customer will get an email that would look similar to this. You would have an Epicor notification, whatever your subject line is, and the way you formatted your email with your e-invoice attached. Now that is a manual way to do this. Again, that's the long way to do it. We don't want to do it that way, because the whole point of setting up e-invoices is we want to mass generate multiple e-invoices to our customers. One other thing to note is when we do the mass generate, each e-invoice will be generated as a separate email. There will not, if there are multiple invoices for ACE here, they will receive 2 emails, one for each invoice. So in order to do the mass generate, you want to go into mass generate e-invoice, and I apologize, all of these modules are found under financial management, accounts receivable, general operations. I just had them set in my favorites for this demonstration. So this is mass e-invoice generation. It looks a lot like our generate e-invoice from the invoice tracker. And what you can do is you can actually filter it by certain customers. You can filter it by the transaction type. So if you had separate transaction types, so like credits, or one of my customers asked me if they could have separate out e-invoices based on each accounts receivable, employee. That's where you would probably want to set that up, is inside the transaction type, and have certain authorized users for that type. And then also you would filter it by date of when you want to generate and process these e-invoices. So again, if we wanted to do it for the month of August, you come in and you select your range filters and you click process. And what that's going to do is it's going to generate and send all of the e-invoices for any customer that was set up as send e-invoice and process them through.
Hey, Billy, I know Mike Huffer just asked a question about where the PDFs are stored. Can they be stored in DocStar? Off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that. I just know that DocStar is completely and fully integrated within Epicor for for other financials. So I'm pretty sure they can be, although we have not done that yet. Not
So,
sure.
so for e-invoicing, you have to use the file storage type, and that's where I was in attachment type maintenance. So let me jump back in there and I'll show you. So it's, let's see, that base URL, it looks like my Epicor is locking up here real quick, but there's a base URL inside of attachment maintenance. Throw up the PowerPoint again. Minimize. There's a base URL where it will store your attachments inside of attachment maintenance. Now, if you're in the cloud, you actually have to use something called client transfer service here, but you can access it to wherever you have your attachments set up. So again, we generated the mass generation of e-invoices. Process was submitted. If I go back to my dashboard, I can reset this and see that these were generated, and note, we don't see sent here because of our email. I don't have our SMTP. That was one other thing I guess I forgot to mention. Get with your IT group and make sure that they have your SMTP email settings set up in company maintenance. If not, if you don't have email set up in your environment, that's the first step, I guess, in the process, is to make sure that you have email set up. And that can be found inside of company maintenance, email and reporting. Notice I don't have my SMTP server set up, which is why we're not generating emails. But again, that's a pretty simple setup for your IT manager to get that set up and for you to actually access emailing in the system, which more than likely you probably already have set up in the system. But again, that's the most of that went through the whole configuration and setup. It's pretty quick and easy. A couple of things that I did want to also mention. I have a separate slide here. Considerations for successful deployment. A couple of things from my experience of using this is inform your customers that you're going this route. There's a lot of security settings inside of emails that prevent, certain emails from processing to your users, right? You may have to whitelist an email address so that your customers are actually getting the e-invoices. So that's one thing that I definitely recommend. Reach out to your customers, let them know what address will be sending the email to them so they are aware. And then also maybe follow up. Once you first deploy and implement, make sure you follow up with your customers and they are getting your invoices. Of course, utilize the dashboards and tools. One thing you can do is you can set up that mass generate e-invoice on a process set to automatically run at a certain time. Maybe you run it, bi-monthly. Maybe you run it at the first of every month, the end of every month, however you see fit. That way, it doesn't require a lot of, user experience. If you have your accounting department that are going in and just entering the invoices and posting their batches, and you have that set up to run process automatically, your invoices are being generated and your accounting group is just staying focused on posting invoicing, right? They're not going into Outlook and sending all of your customers emails. Another thing is just to CC your AR department to make sure there's no other issues. Maybe your task agent is down, or maybe there was someone's configured your email settings and messed up something there. So as long as you have someone that's keeping record or seeing these invoices being generated in their email address, you can be confident that your customers are receiving them as well. But again, that was just the quick and simple configuration for this. I know we had originally planned for an hour and we're way ahead of schedule here, but I did just wanted to make sure that we went through everything that's required to set this up. As I mentioned, this is only available in 10.2, 500, and 600. Epicor did a good job of kind of listening to the customers and the users on this one, because previously, sending emails automatically inside of the system required a BPM. or it required you actually having to go in and use that print preview to send the email out to your users. But